Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on supporting positive sport parenting for coaches, clubs, and parents. My name is Alex, and I'm with Sport for Life, and we're really excited about the webinar today. We'll get started right on time, so everyone who is here can see the webinar as it starts. A couple save the dates to just let you know about. There's a couple more webinars happening in the next 2 months, so put them on your calendar. Creating inclusion of newcomers in sport and physical activity on October 30th, and making multi-sport work on November 27th. Housekeeping items for today. You have a control panel in front of you, and on that control panel, you can make it minimize into the side of the screen if you're having trouble seeing the full slides that are up. You can also mute or unmute yourself. We've set it so that everyone is muted for now. You can switch to full screen if you would like. At the end, we'll have an opportunity to answer some questions. And if you raise your hand using this icon here at the end when we have our question period, you can click and we'll be able to unmute you so you can ask your question. If you do have questions over the course of the webinar though, please do type them into the question box, and we'll have people looking at the questions and we'll consolidate them at the end to ask. Or if you're having any technical difficulties, or if there's a question coming from one of the presenters, you can type it into this question box and we will capture it there. If you have any trouble hearing things like that, do please also write it in there, and we can help you troubleshoot and make it so that this webinar is easy for you to participate in. I'm going to have Lynn from Active for Life do a short introduction here now. Lynn, you might need to unmute yourself in order to do the introduction. We haven't been able to hear you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, my name's Lynn Jobe. I work for Active for Life, and just to start off, I'd like to say thanks very much to Sport for Life for hosting this webinar with us. It's part of our second Parents in Sport Week, which is a social media campaign. Active for Life brought Parents in Sport Week over from the UK with permission from Dr. Camilla Knight and the Child Protection and Sport Unit. They launched the campaign first in 2016, and we joined in 2017. We provide a toolkit that where you'll find a variety of articles and resources that you can use to help parents, coaches, and sport organizations understand and promote positive sport parenting. We hope you'll join in the conversation this week on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram using the hashtags sportsparents and PISW. I'd encourage you to post some video messages. They're always really popular. You can thank your parents for their contributions to your club, or have some of your athletes thank their parents on video, or a written message, and you can always include an image from the toolkit. Thanks for promoting positive parenting, because as we'll hear today, positive involvement from parents is critical to young people's enjoyment and success in sport. Next slide, Alex. And so these are just two examples of images from the toolkits that you can use in your messaging. There's also a podcast there from Dr. Camilla Knight. And at this point, we'd like to ask who's in this webinar. So Alex, would you like to put up the polls? So please answer this. Do you have children in sport? And next we're going to ask what your role is, but for now. Okay, interesting. 69% with children, 31% without. Let's go to the next poll. So what is your primary role? Select one of the following: coach, sport administrator, that would be paid, parent, a volunteer board or committee member, or others. Interesting. Glad to have some parents on the line and some board members. And do we get to see what the others were, Alex, that wrote in answers?
Yeah, I have someone wrote in that they're a team manager and a parent.
Okay, cool. Alrighty, next slide. We'll get going. I'll introduce your presenters for today. So we're very pleased to have two leading authorities with us today to explore positive sport parenting, specifically how clubs and parents can work together to create a supportive environment where kids, parents, coaches, and clubs can thrive, because that's how we're going to keep kids in sport. So Dr. Nick Holt from the University of Alberta is going to get us started. He is the Associate Dean of Research for Kinesiology, Sport, and Recreation at the University of Alberta. He's participated as an athlete and a coach in several sports, including a lot of soccer. And his research interests include parenting in youth sport, positive youth development through sport, and changing active free play. The big chunk in the middle of today's presentation will be presented by Dr. Catherine Tamanen, who is the assistant professor at the University of Toronto, where her research interests include sports psychology, stress, coping, and emotion, youth sport and adolescent athletes, and qualitative research methodology. There's hardly any emotion in sport, so I'm not really sure where that's going to fit, but so Catherine was sharing her expertise around the athlete, parent, and coach dynamic, as well as presenting evidence-based strategies that you can use to make these complex relationships work. As Alex mentioned, there will be lots of times for Q&A at the end of the presentation, so we look forward to a rich conversation then. And it's over to you, Nick, I think.
All right, thanks, Lynn. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Hello to those people who I know, and welcome to those people I don't. I'm going to keep my part short and let Catherine really do the main part of the presentation. You are looking right now at the happy kids I coach. And I just put this up to highlight to you that, yes, I'm a researcher, but I'm also a youth soccer coach, and I'm a youth soccer parent as well. I'm a dual role parent coach. And if we look at these happy kids, I can tell you I've got a wonderful group of parents to support them. And sure, we face challenges and problems over the years. They're still young. I challenge the parents and encourage the parents on this team to be role models of exemplary youth sport parenting. And I see my job as the coach to both lead them and join them on that journey, knowing that we'll make mistakes along the way. And it's all part of the process of supporting the kids in sport so that they stay involved and they enjoy themselves. So if we just go to the next slide, I've just got a few background photos here, and I'm just going to talk for a couple of minutes. So we did a study not too long ago with 60 provincial sport organizations from 5 provinces, and we asked them what type of research they'd like to see university researchers doing. 42 of the 60 people across the country said they wanted more research on parent education. We've done studies with parents themselves, and parents have told us they want more educational materials and support to help them be good youth sport parents. And then there's tons of work with coaches that say coaches want help dealing with parents. And for those of you involved, in sport in real life, I think you probably would understand that for sport organizations, for parents and for coaches, parental education and support is really important. I've no doubt it's an important topic for stakeholders in youth sport. So Parent in Sport Week is about celebrating the good that parents do. I know we've all had problem parents, but I also know these problem parents are in the minority. Our focus is on the vast majority of parents who are trying to do their best and might need a helping hand from time to time. So in this context, I like the expression that a rising tide lifts all boats. So if we can improve the quality, if you like, of youth sport parenting in general, that will be the rising tide. It might not directly affect the problem parents, but really I want to focus your attention on this vast majority of people who make youth sport work. And many of those people are listening to this webinar, I would think. So in kind of just setting up Catherine's talk, one of the challenges for sure is parenting is more than, in youth sport parenting is more than a list of behaviors. It's more than do's and don'ts behaviors. It's more than signing codes of conduct. It's about knowing what to do, when to do it, and how to create the right emotional environment around sport. So that's not just at the field or the court or surrounding competitions. It's before, during, and after, but it's in the home environment. It's conversations about youth sport that occur. So it's more than just behaviors. Behaviors are important, but it's about knowing what to do, when to do it, and how to create the right emotional environment. And before I let Catherine take it away and talk about some of those things, I just want to say, tweet some stuff about Parenting Sport Week. I tweeted a thank you to my dad yesterday, and get some thank yous out there. Really highlight the role of exemplary parents in youth sport, and this all contribute to rising the tide that'll lift all the boats. So without further ado, I think I'm passing it over to Catherine.
Great, thank you very much, Nick. So I just want to start by thanking everyone for all the webinar attendees here today. I'm really excited to support this Parent in Sport Week initiative and to share some of the findings from our research that are related to supporting positive sport parenting. So overall, our area of research has really been in looking at how we can promote better sport experiences and long-term sport participation for adolescent athletes. And one way in which we've approached this topic is by looking at parental involvement in sport in a number of different ways. So two main topics that I'll be talking about today are parents' influence on coping in sport and looking at how parents influence the way that athletes cope with stress in sport to ultimately have better sport experiences and then maintain their participation in sport. And then I'll also be turning my attention to talk about parent-athlete communication in relation to their sport experiences. And then within each of these areas, I'll be offering some strategies based on the research that we've conducted to help parents and athletes, help athletes cope with stress in sport, and also some strategies to help foster positive communication in sport. And following the webinar, the key points from this presentation will be made available and emailed out to webinar participants and made available online. So you'll have access to them, and you can also share them with others within your organization. So when we start by thinking about parents' influence on athletes coping in sport, we should start by talking about the kinds of stressors that athletes experience in youth sport settings. So athletes talk about a number of things that they might find stressful in their sport participation. This can include feeling a pressure to perform or feeling that there's an overemphasis on winning, conflicts with their coaches or opponents or even teammates, fear of injury, and then concerns or stress around making errors or performance mistakes in competition. And it's also important to acknowledge that in some cases, parents may also contribute to some of these stressors and contribute to that feeling of pressure to perform or feeling concerns about their performance mistakes. But parents can also help athletes in learning to deal with these stressors in sport. So parents may contribute to these stressors, but also might help to improve the way that athletes deal with these things. So when we think about the way that athletes might cope with these different stressors in sport, there are a number of different strategies or approaches that athletes might take to deal with these stressful experiences. So one group of strategies or category of strategies to deal with stress in sport can be referred to as task-oriented or engagement-oriented coping strategies. And this includes a variety of different approaches to deal with a stressor head-on or to approach the situation to try to manage it. And it can include things such as asking someone for advice about the problem, thinking positively, using imagery, self-talk, relaxation, breathing, or logically analyzing the problem or thinking about the opponent's strengths and weaknesses to try to overcome that situation. On the other hand, there can be different types of coping strategies that athletes might use that could include more disengagement-oriented coping. So this includes strategies that athletes might use to disengage from the stressor and try to remove themselves from it. These are reflected by feelings of hopelessness or feeling discouraged, using wishful thinking, just wishing the competition would end so that they could stop being in this situation, or even avoiding others to avoid a stressful encounter. And then a third category of coping strategies that athletes might use to deal with stress in sport are described as distraction-oriented coping strategies. And these are strategies to distract yourself from the stressor. So it can include thinking about other things, or athletes might try to listen to music to avoid thinking about a situation that might be stressful for them. Now, overall, athletes report using a combination of coping strategies to deal with stress in sport. And there is no universally effective or ineffective strategy to cope with stress. So in some cases, it might be useful and effective to deal with a stressor head-on and use engagement coping strategies, so increasing effort or asking for advice about the problem. But in other cases, it might be useful to avoid thinking about the problem momentarily, or to distract yourself to avoid thinking about the situation for a brief period of time. But by and large, it appears that the task-oriented coping strategies and these engagement coping strategies are generally seen as more adaptive and more effective for athletes in coping with stress in sport. So there is some evidence that might suggest that using disengagement coping or distraction coping can be useful in some situations. Overall, it seems that encouraging athletes to use more task-oriented or engagement coping is associated with more adaptive outcomes. So in this context of understanding how athletes deal with stress in sport, we're interested in understanding how parents influence coping among young athletes. And we're interested in exploring some of the research around this area. So there is research to suggest that what parents say and do has an influence on the types of strategies that athletes use to cope with stress in sport. Among swimmers participating in a study in 2006, Lafferty and Durrell found that perceptions of parental support among the athletes were associated with the types of coping strategies they used. So athletes who had low perceptions of parental support reported using less active, engagement-oriented coping strategies, and they also used, or they decreased their effort in training when dealing with stressful situations. And these athletes who had lower perceptions of parental support also had an increase in the use of self-blame and venting of emotions. So parental support is important for athletes' use of coping strategies in sport. We also know that the kinds of things that parents tell athletes about coping with stress is important for the way that athletes actually cope with stress in sport. So one study we conducted looking at parents' socialization of coping, which is the things that parents talk about among their children, telling them to use engagement or disengagement coping strategies in sport. This socialization of coping was associated with athletes' use of those coping strategies. So for athletes who reported low levels of disengagement coping, they were the athletes who also felt they had high levels of parental support, and their parents reported using low socialization of disengagement coping. So the key takeaway from this slide here is that what parents say to their athletes about coping with stress in sport and what athletes perceive in terms of the support that they feel from their parents, it matters. It influences the kinds of things that athletes will do when coping with stressful situations. And we know that these types of coping strategies are important for athletes' long-term sport enjoyment and participation. So since we know that parents have an influence on athletes' coping, one study that we conducted was looking at how parents and coaches influence the development of coping among young athletes. And so this study looked at how athletes learn to cope with stress in sport, and we also examined the role that parents and coaches play in that process. So I'm going to present just a few key findings based on the study. In the study, we interviewed 17 athletes, 10 parents, and 7 coaches. And they also provided suggestions of strategies to help athletes develop coping skills in sport. So I'll share those with you as well. So the first main finding from the study was that learning to cope was really a process of trial and error, and that it was best facilitated in a supportive environment created by parents and coaches. So athletes and parents and coaches were telling us that learning to cope with stress was different for everyone, but you had to find out what works for you through a process of trial and error. But athletes also reflected the idea that if you have parents that don't support you or that you can't talk to, or coaches that tear you down, you're obviously going to have a hard time learning to cope. And so being able to integrate the feedback that parents and coaches provide is easier when you have a better relationship with your parents and coaches. So having that supportive environment was a foundational piece for helping athletes learn to cope with stress in sport. Another key finding here was that helping athletes reflect on their coping and develop reflective practice was extremely important and facilitated coping in these young athletes. So athletes here said, when you actually think about what you're thinking about, it does help a lot. And athletes said they might not necessarily always reflect on their own experiences, but that by hearing their parents and coaches talk about their experiences dealing with stress, they were able to integrate that information into their current stress experience and understand how it might relate and draw some lessons learned from it there as well. So sharing stories or experiences from parents and coaches when discussing stress in sport was another useful strategy that parents and coaches use to try to help convey some of that information to athletes. So based on some of these findings, parents and coaches and athletes provided a number of strategies for parents to help athletes learn to cope better with stress in sport. So the first of these, as I mentioned, was maintaining a supportive environment. So having that foundational piece really facilitated a lot of these other strategies and the improvement of in coping in these athletes. It was important for athletes to experience this supportive environment by having parents and coaches use questioning and reminding about previous experiences rather than telling athletes directly what to do to cope with stress. So as one mother said, the quieter I am, the more I get to hear. Because as soon as I say, well, you should do this and you should do that, then I think they don't say as much. And this mother recognized that by letting her athlete respond to questions about coping with stress in sport was a more effective strategy in helping the athlete learn to develop these effective coping skills. As I mentioned, providing perspective and sharing experiences was also really important for parents and coaches to be able to share lessons about coping strategies that might be effective in dealing with stressors. And also describing stressors as learning opportunities. So really using questions to help athletes see what they might be learning from this experience rather than seeing it simply as a stressful experience that has to be managed. And parents also described using informal conversations about coping and seizing on opportunities, maybe not in the moment, but after the fact, or bringing up informal opportunities to describe or to discuss coping, rather than trying to deal with it immediately as the athlete is full of strong emotions. So all of these strategies collectively contribute to the development of coping strategies among young athletes. And really, the main focus here is to help athletes develop that reflective practice, to foster athletes' ability to reflect on their coping efforts and then think about how they might apply those coping strategies in the future to deal with subsequent stressors in sport. So these are some practical tips and strategies that could help support athletes in coping with stress in sport. And another area of focus that is prominent here is the role of parent communication in talking to their athletes about their experiences in sport. So that's the section I'm going to turn my attention to now. Another area of research that we've explored over the past several years is looking at how parents communicate with their children in youth sport. So parent communication is one aspect of parental influence in youth sport. And so I'll talk a little bit about how this reflects more supportive sport parenting and how we might be able to foster more supportive parenting in this regard. So there's been quite a good deal of research looking at parent behaviors surrounding sport competitions. We all have experiences hearing parents talking to their kids before games, during games, seeing a wide variety of sideline behaviors. And so I'm going to talk briefly about some research that Nick led, examining parent communication during competitions. And then I'll talk about some research that we've been doing looking at parent-athlete communication after competitions. So in one study, we looked at the types of behaviors and comments that parents made during competitions, the sideline behaviors from parents to athletes and also to coaches and to referees that contribute to an overall emotional climate on the sidelines. And there are a number of parent behaviors and communication strategies or feedback that parents engage in, ranging from encouragement to derogatory comments. So I'll just briefly go over these. Praise and encouragement included positive comments, supportive comments about the athlete or the team, so really celebratory comments. Performance contingent feedback were comments intended to improve an athlete's performance or a team's performance, perhaps after an athlete made a mistake, then providing instruction about how to improve that performance. Instruction referred to things like direct commands, so pass the ball or shoot the puck. Striking a balance referred to comments or verbal reactions that generally provided a balance between positive and negative comments. So perhaps starting with a negative comment if an athlete let in a goal, saying, oh no, and then, oh well, good try. So striking a balance between negative and positive comments. And then parents also make negative comments referring to negative reactions during the game or saying, that was a bad shot or a bad call, ref. And then parents also sometimes make derogatory comments. And these may stick in our memory, but there are often fewer of these derogatory comments, but we do see varying proportions of the other types of comments that parents make on the sidelines. And so we can see that these range on a continuum from more supportive types of comments and behaviors to more controlling negative types of behaviors. And there's been research also looking at how different factors surrounding the social environment of the game might influence the types of comments and behaviors that parents engage in. So these types of comments might be influenced by competition factors. In a close game, we might see more emotion and we might see more intense comments from parents, perhaps more instruction or more negative comments depending on who the game is against and the score and the time of the game. We also see that there are variations in these comments based on the child's performance. So if the child is performing very well, we might expect more positive comments. These might also be influenced by policies within the sport environment. So clubs and teams might have policies about parental behavior, and this might influence the extent to which we see these types of behaviors in a youth sport setting. And they might also be influenced by parent factors. So parents' own perceptions and empathy and perhaps their knowledge about the game or the sport. There's recent research suggesting that these types of behaviors are influenced by parents' own coping skills and their own emotional intelligence. And other research has suggested that the types of comments that parents make are influenced by their goals and their values that underlie their motivations for being involved in sport and having their child involved in sport. So the idea here is that there's a wide variety of things that parents say and do in their sideline behaviors, and these are influenced by a number of factors, but collectively, these all contribute to that overall emotional climate that Nick was mentioning at the beginning of the webinar. And so the idea, ultimately, I think, would be to try to promote a more positive emotional climate, which is more supportive of young athletes' positive experiences in sport. So these are some public behaviors and experiences that we might see on the sidelines, and they may reflect parents' attitudes and the extent to which they're more supportive or perhaps more negative or controlling in sport. And I'm going to turn now to talk about parents' communication with their athletes individually, one-on-one, after competition. And I'm going to share some information with you about some research we've been conducting looking at the car ride home among athletes after competition has ended. So we look at the car ride home as potentially a window of opportunity for parents to socialize children's sport experiences. It's this window which might be used for debriefing after the game, where parents have opportunities to communicate values and messages about what's important in sport to their child. And so we're really interested in exploring that dynamic of parent-child communication during the car ride home. Recently, there was an ad campaign by True Sport looking at the car ride home, and they depict an image of a parent and a child and suggesting that it can be quite a negative experience for some athletes. So the link is there, and you can go and check that out after the webinar. But right now, I just wanted to touch on some of the research that we conducted about the car ride home and offer some strategies to help parents navigate that car ride home. So this is based on a study that we conducted a couple years ago, and we interviewed athletes and their parents, and they provided their experiences and also some suggestions for promoting more positive sport experiences in this context. So one of the things that athletes and parents told us was that a lot of the experience on the car ride home generally revolved around providing performance advice or feedback. And so there was an opportunity for debriefing during the car ride home. Athletes said, on the way back, he tells me, my dad tells me things that I could have tried doing during the game or things that I should do differently. So there was a lot of feedback being provided during the car ride home. Athletes also said that even if we win, my parents will still find a way to try to think of what I did wrong so that, again, in the next game, it'll be better. So there seemed to be a bit of an underlying message here that after a game, athletes should be provided with feedback and that this is ultimately in order to improve and get better. So that seems to be one of the key messages that was being conveyed in these conversations, that there was this idea that improvement was a good thing. And parents also said that athletes sought out this information, that one mother said, every time we come back from a game, she'll ask me, be honest, what did I do good? What did I do bad? And so parents did recognize that sometimes they were providing performance feedback that their child might find hard to take, but that athletes often came to them and said, well, tell me what I did wrong because I want to improve. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just that the way in which this feedback is provided might be more positive or more negative for these athletes and parents. And so this is part of what we were trying to explore in our study. Some of the negative experiences that parents and athletes described really centered around heightened emotions in that car ride home. So, for example, one athlete said after she performed poorly in competition, she was describing her interaction with her mother, and she said, I can tell if she's moody, she's not happy with me, she'll kind of ignore me, she wouldn't talk to me. This athlete said that she can tell that her mother's not in a good mood. And she says, if I lost to someone I shouldn't have lost to, my mom will probably not be happy with me. But then I'll give her some time, and then we would talk it over after. And it really reflects here the idea that the athlete is sensitive about the parent's emotional state and feeling that she needed to let her parent cool down before she could talk to her about her performance. So it really reflects the idea that there are some heightened negative emotions that athletes might bring to the car ride home, but parents bring that into the car as well and into that debriefing period. Some other negative experiences reflected maybe not common experiences, but certainly athletes described some situations where sometimes this athlete said she got into the car and one time her father screamed at her. He was like, what was that? And I was thinking, he's a crazy person. So athletes did describe some very emotional experiences during the car ride home. And coaches and administrators might be familiar with some of these types of experiences or know that some parents might be particularly emotional in debriefing with their children. So we know that the car ride home is an important window of opportunity for socializing young athletes' experiences, and that it can be valuable for providing feedback to athletes about their performance and providing messages about what is important in sport, but that sometimes these experiences can be quite negative. So based on this research, participants provided us with strategies to try to help and navigate the car ride home. So some of these strategies include taking time to think for both of you, taking time to let the athlete cool down, but also taking time as a parent to cool down and to think about your own emotional experiences and to reflect on why you might be so emotionally worked up about that experience. Another piece of advice that parents and athletes gave was to try to de-emphasize performance outcomes or losses. So to try to move the emphasis of the conversation away from winning and losing, but really to look rather at how athletes performed personally. So were there particular skills that they were implementing quite well? Are there other types of things that they were demonstrating, such as positive teammate interactions? Were they being a supportive member of their team, even if the team lost? These are all important values to try to communicate in these debriefing periods. Another strategy for navigating the car ride home was to use questions in a supportive manner. So this is really echoing the findings from our earlier research about asking questions in a supportive environment. So, for example, instead of saying things like, "Oh, how did you miss that shot?" trying to reformulate questions can be more effective, and trying to understand the athlete's perspective and asking them in a gentler manner rather than an accusatory tone. So saying something, for example, like, "What were you seeing on the field when that was happening?" and trying to ask it in a way that is not attacking the athlete, but really trying to understand what was going on for them at the time. Another piece that parents and athletes talked about was developing rules of the road. So having conversations about the car ride home and saying, what would you like to discuss? Are there rules that we should have? So we have to say 3 positive things before we start to get into what needs to be fixed. Are there certain topics that are off limits during the car ride home, and we can save those conversations for later? So having conversations about the car ride home and developing some rules of the road could be an effective strategy for negotiating the types of conversations that go on in that context. And then for parents, it's important to ask yourselves what values you're promoting with your questions and comments to your child. So reflecting on what you're communicating through the types of messages you're sending. And ultimately, parents and athletes talked about the importance of being positive and supportive. As one athlete said, "I kind of wish they would be a little supportive, because at the end of the day, they're my parents, and so they should be supportive no matter what." And this goes back to that key finding that promoting positive sport experiences really starts with that positive supportive environment that parents can create. So, based on these studies, we're really interested in looking at ways to engage parents to try to develop more positive communication with their child in sport. And so we have a number of projects going on, but one I wanted to talk to you about today is to share some initial results from research by a master's student of mine who recently completed his thesis research examining parental communication and the use of reflective practice among youth sport parents. So my student, Sina Azimi, just recently completed his master's degree and is currently a PhD student here at the University of Toronto. And for his master's research, he took a novel approach to try to help parents and engage them in reflecting on their communication behaviors to try to improve their communication with these young athletes. So over a 6-week period, Sina engaged parents in reflective practice about their communication with their child, and this enabled them to reflect on what they were saying and how they were communicating with their child. Parents completed surveys and interviews at the beginning of the study and the end of the study, and these data were analyzed to look at what changes occurred as a result of participating in this project. So this study was based around a model. Here it's presented, and I'll go over it very briefly. It's called Gibbs' reflective cycle. And parents were encouraged to reflect on their experiences of communicating with their child after games and practices over 6 weeks. And they went through a 6-stage process to describe their experience with their child. So first they would describe, what did you talk about? What was it like talking to your child about their sport experience? Second, parents would describe the feelings that they had in that conversation. So what feelings did you have? How did you react? Then they provided their evaluation and analysis of their communication. So an initial evaluation of the experience, what was good about it, what was bad about it, and then trying to make sense of that experience. So analyzing what elements of the experience were good or bad, and then concluding, what they've learned about that based on that communication interaction with their child, and then finally developing an action plan to propose any potential changes that they might implement the next time that they talk to their child after a game or a practice or a competition. And so based on this 6-step model that parents engaged in, there was a good deal of positive feedback that parents and athletes reported regarding the changes that they experienced in their communication. So for example, one parent said, "It made me much more aware of the things I say and what I focus on after and why I'm saying it. I think most of the time you really play a big role in just boosting their confidence, being a sounding board and letting them vent. So it made me just sometimes go like zip it when my instinct is to talk." So parents reported changes in the content and the topic of their conversation, their awareness about their communication patterns with their child, and also developed different awareness about their role in being a sounding board and how they play a supportive role in their child's sport experiences. Athletes also described some changes. So one athlete here reflected that she felt her father was trying to ask me more questions, how I was feeling, and took my feelings into account more. He actually understands why and tries to put himself in my shoes. So there were some athletes that felt that their parents were already fairly positive in their communication with them after games and practices, but there is emerging evidence here that these types of practices can be used to engage parents to reflect on their communication behaviors and improve their communication with their child in sport. So hopefully this information is useful for the webinar attendees in thinking about strategies for engaging parents in more positive sport parenting practices, and also in providing coaches and clubs and teams with information that you can then pass on to others in your organization about improving parents' influence in sport by helping athletes cope with stress in sport, using parents as a vehicle to help improve that, and also in improving parent-athlete communication. And then I wanted to end by briefly commenting on how coaches and teams and clubs might see themselves in promoting positive sport parenting. So the first piece that I would suggest here is that coaches need to model appropriate behaviors and consistent messages themselves. As Nick mentioned at the start of his piece at the beginning of the webinar, it's important that coaches engage parents and really model those behaviors for parents so that they can see what these types of interactions and behaviors should look like. So coaches and teams and sport administrators really need to walk the walk in providing that type of guidance for parents. The second piece that I find particularly encouraging here is that coaches can also compensate for a lack of parent autonomy support that athletes might perceive. So coaches can be reassured in findings from recent research that coaches have a positive influence on athletes and can compensate for parent behaviors that might be lacking. So if there are parents on your teams who perhaps demonstrate more controlling behaviors, more outcome-oriented, more controlling sort of negative behaviors, it's important to know that for athletes who perceive lower levels of parent support, if those athletes have higher perceptions of coach support, those athletes had significantly improved motivation, need satisfaction, goal attainment compared to athletes who did not have those same high levels of coach support. So the key point here is that even for those athletes for whom their parent support might be lacking, coaches play a huge role in compensating there and can really support that positive development. And then finally, it's really important to engage parents and to provide education and guidance. Often parents say they don't know what to do, so simply by providing them with some information and guidance and educating them on your approaches and modeling those behaviors can be quite useful. And so I will also mention then the value of having resources that are provided through the Active for Life website. There's a toolkit that can be disseminated within your organizations. So really spreading more information about positive sport parenting can go a long way to providing guidance for positive involvement in sport. So with that, I'm going to thank you all for your attention here today. I really appreciate it, and I will turn it back over to Lynn.
Hi. Again, I was muted. I apologize for that. And I wasn't quite ready for that quick
Oh, I'm
end there.
sorry.
So, but here we go. Thank you so much to Catherine and Nick and the Sport for Life Society for co-hosting us on this webinar today. And as we've said, you will be receiving a follow-up email with everything you need. Sorry, I really was just caught a little bit unawares there. Yeah, and I guess we're just going to go to questions and answers. So I hope that this next section will be a rich exploration of some of the suggestions that Catherine and Nick had. Thanks to both of you. We really do appreciate your time.
So during the presentation, Catherine, we had a couple of questions come in. One question was, is the full car ride home study available and can it be included in the follow-up email? And I'll say to everyone, yes, we will include that, and it is the reference was included in the chat if you're curious, and it'll also be included in the follow-up email. But we had a question from Vicky Harbour asking if you could tell us the age of the athletes the findings from the Car Ride Home study were collected from, and if they were athletes older than 12 years, what are your thoughts on parent-child communication in younger athletes?
Well, that's a great question, and thank you, Vicki, for that question. So for that study, we had adolescent athletes. They were between the ages of 11 to 16 years of age, so they were approximately an average age of 13 years old. And so there were male and female athletes, and we also had mothers and fathers in that study. So that was the context. They were from a number of different sports as well. It wasn't just one sport. We had individual sports and team sports, figure skating, baseball, soccer, hockey. But it's a really good question about the different ages and the types of communication that we might engage in with older or younger athletes. Certainly, we should think about our messages and the ways we communicate with athletes in a developmentally appropriate manner. So certainly the conversations that would be had with younger athletes are likely going to be different than the types of messages and conversations that are had with older athletes. We haven't looked at the types of conversations that go on with younger athletes. Oftentimes from what we hear from parents and athletes anecdotally, even with some of the older athletes, there tends to be just less of a conversation overall about sport with younger athletes. So it tends to be, how was it? It was great. It was fun. What did you enjoy? I enjoyed the passing drill, or I enjoyed this part. But there tends to be less of that critical analysis of the game or practice itself. And then as athletes develop and perhaps become more competitive or compete at higher levels in their sport, the attention in those conversations might shift to more analysis of their performance. That would be my suspicion based on anecdotal evidence. Again, we haven't done studies comparing developmental differences in those conversations, but it is an excellent question, so I really appreciate that. I wonder if, Nick, if you have any thoughts on that, or perhaps as a parent yourself, you might have any feedback on those kind of different types of conversations at different ages.
Not really. With the little ones, you don't need to talk about anything to do with the game. That's what I do. So with my daughter's 12, we don't really talk about it. We just talk about whatever she wants to talk about, unless she asks the question, what do you think?
Great, thank you. I also typed out sort of your response in summary, Catherine, for anyone who is following along and wants to see it written. We have a question from Corey asking, he says the Facebook page Offside has found success in public shaming parents behaving badly by posting videos. What are your opinions regarding this?
Nick, I'll let you start with that one.
If I don't know that, well, I'm not on Facebook, so I don't know that particular thing. So it's basically shame. It sounds like it's shame bad behavior. So that's one way to go. Another way to go is celebrating good behavior. I am certainly on the side of celebrating good behavior. I don't know what change shaming bad behavior would create, but I mean, does it change the behavior of those bad parents? I'd ask that. I go back to what I said right at the start. I'll actually be a bit more precise. What I have found is the parents who are what you might call the problem parents, it's very difficult to reach them. It's very difficult to connect with them and to suggest changing behaviors because they're not really listening. So I go back to that massive group in the middle. Well, they're not in the middle. It's the massive group. It's the majority. And it's about trying to rise that, lift that group and help those people become more effective parents. So, I don't have really strong feelings about that one way or another, but I think my own approach is a bit more strength-based, a bit more positively focused. and trying to celebrate excellent parents rather than shaming bad parents, but I can understand it.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I agree with Nick and echo his comments that it's probably better to promote and support the positive behaviors, which kind of helps create social norms around what is considered positive sport parenting behaviors. I think one of the problems with the idea of online shaming is that the person who is the target might never see themselves there, and as Nick said, they might not, be listening to hear that feedback. They might not care if they see themselves in that video, and it's so removed from the immediate situation that it's hard to know whether that may have an impact. The other piece that I'll comment on is that by filming or getting into this idea of public shaming, it doesn't provide those parents or other parents with any types of target behaviors or reference behaviors that they should be endorsing or emulating. So, it's one thing to point out bad behaviors, but it's better to provide people with substitute behaviors and positive things that they could be doing instead, which gets back to the idea of celebrating and lifting up positive sport parents and really showcasing what parents are doing well, and that can help to create that positive social norm rather than just targeting those few instances where parents are behaving negatively.
Great, thank you, Catherine. And thank you, Nick. We have another question here coming in from Christian, who asks, is there any difference between elite athletes and the recreational ones, and the feedback that or in the car ride home is what I'm assuming he's asking, and that you're getting from elite versus recreational athletes?
That's a great question. We have not explored differences according to a competitive stage. So in our sample, they were competitive athletes, but not elite athletes, and not lower levels of recreational athletes. So kind of in the middle levels of competition. My suspicion would be that in more elite levels of competition, that there are likely, again, more conversations going on around performance analysis, performance feedback. But that, again, also depends on the parent's level of knowledge in the sport. So if they have a child involved in elite sport, but they themselves don't know much about the sport or the technicalities of the sport, then I'm not sure that the conversation would be terribly analytical about like what technical changes have to be made. However, it might be, but the parent might not be providing the same kinds of feedback or information that the coach would provide, which can create some complications and mixed messages there. So I think that there may be differences in the types of things that parents and athletes talk about depending on competitive level, and also the amount of time that they spend talking about sport. So athletes who are more competitive, maybe their parents and they talk more about it during the car ride home, but there's probably a lot of other factors that are influencing that type of communication as well. So they might have, just always established patterns of not really talking about sport in the car ride home. So they just don't talk about it in the car ride home, regardless of the competitive level. I will mention that we are continuing to explore these patterns of communication. So we have some follow-up research going on, but we're very early in our data analysis and data collection stages. So we aren't able to see any other patterns other than what we've got in the first study that we did.
Great, thank you, Catherine. We have a question here from Liz, who says, would you say that the majority of parents are healthy sport parents that you've encountered?
I can take that. Yes, we've actually, Catherine touched upon it. We've done studies where you go in and observe, like literally on the sidelines, noting what parents say and what parents shout. So we've done that in Canada. Other people have done it in Canada. There's studies in New Zealand. I just finished being one on a study in Portugal. So there's no doubt that it's the majority are involved in healthy and supportive ways, or at least are trying to be involved in healthy and supportive ways. I guess the question is more about how effectively parents are supporting their kids. The funny thing, the flip side of it is you look at studies with coaches and administrators and ask them what are they concerned about, and they'll jump to parents straight away. because I think challenging parents take up a lot of time. So it probably skews the kind of view. If you run a club and you've got 100 kids and almost 2,000 parents, and you spend a lot of time with 20 parents who are problematic, probably feels like parents are a problem, but you've got to remember all those other ones who are trying to do their best. And I think that's where the education and support comes in. That it's for all those other ones who are trying to do their best. And I just made a list of a few things here, really practical things. I'll just fire through them if that's all right, Alex.
Sure.
Is that all right? No, okay. I think from a coaching perspective, from an organizational perspective, things like preseason meetings are opportunities to educate and support parents, not just tell them about the logistics of the season, giving them little tips about what they can do and how they can do things. I think open and honest communication from clubs and coaches, might not always be fun, is really important. For those clubs that use TeamSnap or whatever else, I only know TeamSnap. It's a tool to communicate, to share resources, to share information, to share videos. And I think giving parents opportunities to get involved in ways that suit them is a really important element of giving parents ownership over the youth sport experience. And I'm going to flip then, just fast forward to something that Catherine said, actually, so I'm going back. As a coach, one thing I've done, I know autonomy supportive stuff is really, really important. And so I've gone into tournaments and let kids self-organize. So organize the lines. I give them the lines. I set the boundaries. I give them the lines. And they come up with the game plan. They come up with the positions. And then I sit there and I'm just there to help. And I say to the parents afterwards, the kids self-organize. This was a good life lesson for them. And of course, it goes really well because the kids are so engaged because they're on top of things. And I'm there to just keep things on track. And if coaches show that you can trust and support kids' autonomy, I think that seeps into what parents can do as well. So it goes back to the coach as a leader of the journey and sharing the journey of becoming exemplary youth sport parents and rising the tide for everybody.
Thanks, Nick. I have another question here to add in from Cecilia, who says she sometimes tries to make comments or remarks to help her child in an individual sport that are not so positive, but to help my child get out of a negative circle that I'm sensing she is in. And so that's kind of a comment question, maybe asking, is that something that should be done, shouldn't be done, or are there better ways that she could be giving that support to her child?
Well, I'll say to Cecilia that it's awesome that you're on this webinar, that you asked that question, and that you're talking to your child. The best person to answer your question is your child, and actually, just the simple task of asking that will show you are supportive. So, a way to ask the question is, what help do you need from me? And if you can get a clear sense of the help that he or she needs, then that'll really, it gives you the green light to, if that's the type of help that they want, then you get the green light to go ahead. And if the answer's no, back off, then you know. So I would use that as a source of conversation. And if they don't know, send me an email and I'll help you.
Thanks, Nick. I have another question. This one's from Lynn, saying it feels like some coaches and clubs can be resistant to engaging parents. Do you have any ideas around how to reach them to help them understand how to work with parents to create a positive and safe environment at their club?
I'll let you take that one, Nick. You've got more coaching experience than I do.
My opening question to those clubs would be, would you survive without the parents? So I suspect there's few youth sport clubs or organizations that would be able to survive in the absence of parental support. That would be the first thing. And then, I mean, one way of framing it is parents as a resource for the club. Parents as a resource. And that comes back to open and honest communication. So parents can fulfill a variety of different roles. And if clubs are not willing to engage parents and view parents as a resource, it's a missed opportunity. It's a huge missed opportunity. And I would imagine there's lots of examples in different sports of clubs that really successfully engage parents, and that might persuade other clubs to do the same kind of thing. So yeah, it's a funny one. If clubs are resistant to making the most of an incredible resource that they have on their hands.
Yeah, I'll agree. I'll jump in and agree with you, Nick, there. I think it's one of the questions I have is really like, what are you afraid of by positioning parents in that way that we want to keep them as far away as possible? It really positions parents as this like potential threat. Like it puts everybody on the defensive, and that's kind of concerning. It's kind of worrying. And I agree that if we view parents from a more strengths-based approach, right, if we see the potential for all the positives that can come out of engaging parents, you know, I think if you're worried about opening the floodgates to this tide of negative parents, I don't think that that's the case. I think the overwhelming majority of parents are really positive and engaged and are coming at it from a good place. They want positive experiences for their kids, and hopefully that's what the sport club wants as well. So I would really see it as an opportunity to work with them rather than seeing them as, you know, this type of threat that needs to be managed and kept away. I think that can really lead to some negative, you know, opportunities for conflict.
And I guess a follow-up to that, to either one of you, do you have an example of any clubs that are doing a great job that you could say we could look at as are being leaders in how they approach their conversations with parents?
Well,
Or
I'd
for
like
supporting
to
parents, I guess.
I'm not going to pick a particular club publicly. I can tell you the one I'm involved with does a great job, but yeah, there's loads out there. Seek them out.
Great, thanks. That appears to be all of our questions for today, unless anyone has, oh, wait, if somebody's jumping in with a couple other questions, do please type any questions into the question pane if you have any other ones. This question comes from Georgina, who says, some clubs ban problematic parents from the sidelines. Do you have any alternative suggestions for managing these difficult behaviors?
Would you like me to take that, Catherine?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I've come across this as well, and I have to say that on a practical level, been involved in doing something similar early on. If parents are having a negative effect, if a parent is having a negative effect on the children's experiences in sport, so I mean more generally, I do think there's a case for removing that parent initially, create a little bit of breathing room, and then providing that person with some education and training and resource and support as well. And just trying to help that person understand, by you doing this, you're having a negative effect on your kid and all the other kids. And I sometimes think that's the way to get through. Like if you can somehow get that message through, that you're not helping, you're making it worse for everybody, then you might get that recognition, change in behavior. So I do understand we're removing someone from the situation in the short term. I think in the longer term, what I have seen is, so they'll get kicked back from one club, and then they'll go to another club, and then they'll go to another club because, you know, then whatever the parenting behavior is not acceptable. So the parenting behavior just doesn't change. And sometimes I think that we're a bit hesitant to direct have those difficult conversations with parents. I include myself in that. And Yeah, so remove them. Okay, I get it. But then I for sure think, yeah, there has to be a conversation to follow up.
Yeah, and Lynn has another follow-up question related to that. Is can you expand on some specific promising practices with respect to engaging parents? You mentioned parent meeting earlier, and dealing with problem parents is, she says, sometimes asking, how can we help you to feel better about your sport experience and your child's sport experience? So
Yeah.
I guess any suggestions from you on specific promising practices for engaging parents that you can suggest?
Yeah, there's lots. I can see we're close to time. I'll just
Yep.
give one, the last one that I did. If you could do an exercise, have the kids write down on a piece of paper what they are hoping to get out of the season, let's say season. So another way to frame that question is, how will you know if it's been a successful season? So maybe for the kids, what are you hoping to get out of the season? And then for the parents, how will you know if it's been a successful season? Then get the responses from the kids, count up what they kind of put them in themes, see what the kids say, and do the same thing for the parents. It'll be different. I guarantee that there'll be different things from the parents and the kids. And then share that information back with everybody and ask the parents, hey, can you present this to your child? Have a quick chat about it. What it does, then the conversations between the parent and the kid, well, what did you write? What did I write? And it's goal setting. It's trying to, and we know that having shared goals is a critical starting point for effective relationships. So if you're on the same page for why you're in the sport and what you want to get out of the sport, then that's the foundation. So just a simple little exercise like that, that's the kind of thing I do in a preseason meeting. And sure, you can talk about fees and equipment and whatever else, but those types of little exercises are part of an ongoing parent education and support kind of strategy.
Excellent. Thanks, Nick. Those are some great ideas of things people can definitely put into practice. And it's good timing because this is the start of a lot of sports seasons right now that we're heading into. So hopefully people can take that away and apply that, whether they are a coach or can integrate that into their organizations. I have another question. We have a little longer for questions still, so feel free to type them in. I have one coming in from Colleen, who says some of our Aboriginal communities are involved in mainstream organized sports and have to travel 1 to 3 hours away for away games. In regards to the ride home, how would you de-emphasize racism?
I'll need a bit more on the context there. Is it a ride home? Colleen, I don't know if you can type this back in. Is it a ride home on a bus, or is it parents in the car?
Colleen, maybe I'll unmute you and you can ask your question more specifically. There, Colleen, you're unmuted now. You should be able to ask the question. I'm not really hearing anything from Colleen, but Colleen, you are unmuted if you want to ask it, or you can type into the question to further explain if you would like. I think she might be referring to the bus ride home, and that it's not really with parents, but it's like it's a team ride home together.
Oh. Yeah, very challenging situation. I think I'll kind of assume there might be a coach on the bus there. And so we've done quite a lot of work in with Indigenous peoples, Aboriginal peoples across Canada, and I'm not suggesting for a second I've got a solution to racism and the legacy of colonialism. But I would say an adult trying to facilitate conversations could be an effective way, at least to talk about some of the issues and talk about some of the feelings, and some kind of structure to those conversations is often quite good. So we found this in other stuff. If it becomes a bit of a free-for-all, the conversations might not be as productive as they can be. So some kind of structure can often help. So that could be small groups. It could be writing some things down and sharing them with the coach, and the coach picking out a couple of topics to talk about. So facilitating conversations and then providing some kind of structure might be effective. I would kind of try it in a caring, compassionate manner. And yeah, I'd love to hear how something like that would go, or any challenges you might face.
Mhm. We had a comment come in from Vicky Harbour now, and she's saying, in follow-up to your suggestion, Nick, about sharing goal setting in a team setting, she says changing the game project has an example of a team's approach to shared communication among athletes, parents, and coaches. And she provided a link to what was done in a high school team that was there. So she shared that information in the link, which has now been shared with the rest of the audience today. Great. Well, I'm seeing no further questions. So thank you, everyone participating, and Catherine and Nick today, as well as Active for Life for organizing the presenters and letting us co-host this with them today. It's been a great discussion and very timely, considering it's Sports Parents Week, and hope that this, again, is things that you can integrate into your practice, whether you're coaching or working at a sport organization, or just in the conversations you're having as a parent with your own child on their ride home. So thank you, everyone. And the webinar will be posted tomorrow, and you will receive a link to the recording, as well as some links to some other resources in a follow-up communication. So thank you all, and have a good rest of your day.